Hello and welcome to this evening's Geography and Adventure program talk. My name's Penny Law and I'm the new convener of the program at Brilsey. Tonight we've got Penny Tranter, who is the Royal Meteorological Society Officer Advisor Civil Contingencies, who is going to be introducing tonight's speaker, Grahame Madge, the Senior Press Officer at the Royal Met Society. Without further ado, I'll just give you a few hints on housekeeping. Please, when the talk begins, turn your video off and mute your microphone, because this will be improving the help to improve the recording quality of the Zoom meeting, and all questions will be via the chat function. So if you have questions you'd like to ask Grahame, put them on the chat function and I'll pick them up at the end of the talk. Thanks very much. And now I'll hand you over to Penny Tranter, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks very much, Penny. Well, it gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce Grahame Madge, who is a Senior Press Officer with the Met Office, and he focuses particularly on the communication of climate science. Prior to that, he worked in conservation PR for nearly 2 decades. So outside of his very busy work life, he is a very keen naturalist and enjoys nothing more than observing the UK's wildlife. His interests in conservation and meteorology give him an interesting perspective on the challenges the UK's nature faces from our changing climate. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Grahame for his very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. I'd like to say very much how I'm looking forward to tonight's talk. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about 2 of my favourite topics, climate change and wildlife, and the impacts that climate change is bringing on our natural world. So I'm going to begin by talking about some fairly basic meteorology, looking at climate trends across the UK. I'm sorry there are some graphs and things like that, but I promise that we will get on to the wildlife towards the end of the talk. But I thought it would be quite useful to begin to make the case for why climate scientists are saying that there is evidence in the global and UK climate for climate change. So what we're looking at here is the Central England temperature record for annual temperatures going back to 1659. And this is the longest instrumental temperature record in the world. And it shows here the increase generally that we're seeing in the UK's temperature year on year. Obviously, as you would expect, there's huge variation. But what we're seeing here is the differences compared with the 1961 to 1990 baseline, 4 years all the way up from 1659 to indeed last year. So you can see that if you look there, you've got the trend line, the red line, which attempts to draw a trend through that quite interesting temperature record. And you can see that as we get towards, particularly from the 1970s onwards, you can see that the annual temperature has increased considerably, and that is obviously having an effect on many factors, not just wildlife, but also society as well. Now, to put a little bit more detail on that, we're looking at annual temperatures there. We'll actually have a look at some of the seasonal temperatures from 1880. And there you can see I've color-coded the different seasons. So you can see that all of the seasons are showing a general uplift over the last 3 to 4 decades. Quite a lot of variation, and the seasons don't always match each other, but you can see that there is a general trend towards increasing temperatures. And indeed, the warmest 10 years in the Met Office record for the UK have all been since 2002. So that shows that although our records go back to 1884, the 10 warmest years have all been really in the last 20 years. Putting a little bit more detail on the Central England temperature record, and remember this is an area bounded by Lancashire, London and Bristol, so it's not completely representative of the entire UK, but what we want here is the length of record. And you can see that the annual temperature, when you go back to the sort of 1659 to 1700 period, was about 8.7 degrees, and that over the last 20 years has gone up to about 10.3. But if you look at all of the seasons and the annual figures, you can see that there is an increase. Quite a lot of variation and noise within that, as you would expect, but the general trend is quite clear, and this is what we'll pick up on in the wildlife impacts later on in my talk. Looking at the entire run of the Central England temperature record, you can see that there is a bit of noise in the data. Some seasons actually swap round. So in the early run of that period, summer was the warmest season relative to average, but then you can see that each of the seasons has increased to a point now where we're way above the levels that we were seeing hundreds of years ago. I thought it would be interesting to compare what we're for. That's the tan coloured line, and then you can see within that you can actually see the global trend, the blue line, which is the HADCRU-T5 data set. Now, if you look at that, you can see that the UK trend for temperature, the black dotted line, is generally upward. And you can see the blue dotted line, which is the trend for global temperature, also on a general upward trajectory. Now, UK and global figures don't match each other exactly year on year. We've had the 6 warmest, excuse me, we've had the 6 warmest years on record globally since 2015. That's not the case in the UK, but you can see that there is a very good alignment, especially when you look at the trend lines. Incidentally, the global figure looks as though it's slightly lower, and that is because largely because the global surface temperature includes the measurements from the oceans as well, whereas the temperatures for the UK just include land surface, and obviously land will warm more quickly than sea. That's why it looks as though that's actually higher. If we look at the changes over the period more recently, we can see here I've prepared 2 maps. One shows the average spring temperature from 1961 to 1990, and just by looking at that map you can see that it's only really areas around London and parts of the south coast that over that 30-year period were getting up to spring temperatures around 9 degrees, and this is mean temperature, so this is the combination of overnights and daytime maximum temperatures. But you can see by the next 30-year period, 91 to 2020, that quite a lot of southern and central England are getting up to those values. So both of those maps are to the same legend, and you can see that London now is regularly above 10 degrees, and large swathes of East Anglia up into Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, and on the west coast you've got really from Lancashire down, are areas where you're seeing temperatures now that in the previous 30-year period you would only get perhaps in areas like London or along the coast of the Bristol Channel. But we have to remember that these are averages, and the weather, of course, is a very chaotic system, and indeed, you know, we can get much colder than average springs. So although the general trend is towards warming, we can get cold years. And indeed, you know, if you look at the I've circled the figures for 2013, which was the 9th coldest spring in our temperature series, you can see that we do get the occasional poor spring, and indeed, obviously, with Beast from the East in 2018, we had again similarly cold temperatures. And the point that I want to make here is that wildlife has to cope with the circumstances year on year and day by day. So obviously wildlife doesn't look at the averages, it's a daily fight for survival. So you've got a background of rising temperatures generally, and that is allowing species to increase their ranges, as we'll see later. But on an individual basis, species always have the struggle to survive, and when you get thrown a cold spring like 2013, you can get severe consequences. And indeed, when I was at RSPB, we were one of the country's rarest birds, a bird called the stone curlew, had migrated back from Northern Africa and Southern Europe to its breeding grounds, particularly in East Anglia. And the birds came back, there was no food, the conditions were very cold, and there was a very high mortality. So although the picture is towards warming, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get that every year. So I promised you a talk on phenology. So perhaps it would be an idea to begin with a brief explanation of what phenology is. So phenology is looking at the natural world around us, and by the monitoring of certain aspects, be that the emergence of butterflies or the appearance of frog spawn, it could be the flowering or leafing or budding of trees. Naturalists have been able to gather huge amounts of data going back for centuries on how our natural world is performing in response to weather events, and indeed now with climate change. So I've provided this slide, which introduces a brief timeline of phenology in the UK. Really, Robert Marsham, going back to 1736 until his death in 1797, was the first UK phenologist, and he recorded natural events throughout his life, which have provided a hugely important record going back to that time, against which we can compare records now. Very keen to stress that a lot of this, in fact almost all of phenology, is driven by the passion of individuals and amateurs, and I think that so often is the case with weather and natural history in this country. We're blessed in having a population whose passions are animals and the weather. And when you look at this space where phenology sits, which is exactly between weather and wildlife, we have these relatively vast amounts of data to be able to look over history and see how things have changed. So to bring things up to date more, we've got here Jean Coombs, who has been recording phonological events since 1947, and that has provided a lot more detail about what is happening over the last half a century, 60, 70 years or so. So all this information is being collected, but what does this mean? So a lot of questions that we hear is whether spring is arriving earlier in the UK. And indeed, the UK Spring Index, which is calculated from 4 biological events, the first flowering of hawthorn, the first flowering of horse chestnut, the arrival of swallows, and the emergence of the orange-tipped butterfly. It shows that a lot of these events are actually coming forward, in some cases by up to a month earlier than we would have expected previously. And all this information isn't just valuable at a sort of local level. This is being fed up into government indicators on climate change, and indeed is even forming, you know, parts of international goals and targets on biodiversity. So the work that's done to look at how our wildlife is changing because of weather events and ultimately climate change is hugely important. So if we look at here, what we've got is the spring index on the left-hand side, and you can see that the numbers actually represent days from the 1st of January. So you can see that in the 1890s, we were looking at the index settling around 125 days into the year. But when you look at how that index has gone down, we're now from the year 2000 looking at those events happening really 8 days earlier between 1998 and 2019 than we were between 1891 and 1947. So that just shows that nature is in part responding, but we'll come on to talk about the different rates of that response from wildlife and how that indeed may create its own problems. One of the aspects that's quite important to look at when you're considering is spring arriving earlier in the UK is to actually look at what's called budburst. And by studying oak trees, and this is where Jean Coombs's work has been incredibly important, is to show that budburst is now nearly a month earlier in oak trees than it was at the time that she started her study. So you can see from the graph that there's a huge amount of noise within that data. Not every year is the same as the year before. In fact, there's a good degree of variation on an annual basis. But when you put the trend line through it, you can see that when budburst really at the beginning of her study was happening at the end of April, we're now looking at really towards the early April, if not the beginning and the end of March. So there's huge variation there in how that natural event has changed. And if it wasn't for people like Jean and the other people who have been looking at phenology, then we wouldn't know really much about what was happening. We'd have suspicions, but we wouldn't have the hard data to be able to see and drill down into it about exactly what's going on. So why does it matter if spring comes earlier? I'm sure a lot of people might feel that they'd quite like a shorter winter and longer spring. But from the natural world's point of view, there's obviously the potential for nature's cycles to get out of sync. And one of the basic studies that's been done is looking at the relationship between trees coming into leaf, that feeding caterpillars, and then birds timing their egg laying so that the chicks hatch at the time of maximum caterpillar emergence. So the worry is that this could create a mismatch, an imbalance. So if you look at species like the great tit, for example, great tits have advanced their egg laying, but at the moment there doesn't seem to be too much of a conservation level threat. So it does seem, thankfully, that nature's cycles aren't deviating too much. But what we're looking at with great tit is a bird that is resident in the UK and is able to take advantage of opportunities as soon as the weather allows. It's on site. There's increasing worries about migratory species where they're in Africa, like swallows, for example, nightingales, all of these species traveling back to the UK. And indeed, they have to time their arrival based on conditions in Africa. But when they come back to the UK, quite often a lot of the prime real estate in woodlands and other habitats has already been taken. And resident species can be well underway with nesting by the time migrants arrive. And it's a real concern of conservation organisations like the RSPB and the British Trust for Ornithology that a lot of our migrants do seem to be the ones that are in trouble. They obviously have very long journeys to contend with, and they have unknown circumstances when they actually get back to the UK. Of course, the food chain just doesn't end with songbirds. Clearly, there are predators that rely on timing their own nesting cycle to coincide with the maximum number of birds available so that they can feed their young. Birds like the sparrowhawk, but again, the evidence for declines isn't really there because these species do seem to be doing quite well. And indeed, after extensive persecution, these birds have come back in good numbers and now can be found right the way across the UK in good number. So thankfully, there isn't the evidence that resident birds and birds of prey are being affected by climate change so much. But obviously, we know that nature is facing many, many challenges. And indeed, you know, they're not just dealing with climate change as a single issue, they're actually dealing with climate change on top of persecution, habitat destruction, whole range of different factors. So if we look at what's happening in the plant world, this was a photograph that I actually took today. So I thought I'd get something topical into my talk. So this is a plant called white dead nettle. For those people who don't know it, it's a very familiar wayside plant. Not a native, it's been here for hundreds of years, but it's actually introduced rather than being a native. But it's a very familiar species, and there's been a long-running study in Oxfordshire looking at the timing of this particular species. It's always an early flowerer, and back in the 50s and 60s was more familiar coming out in mid-March. But the season, the flowering season for the species has advanced, studies tell us, by 55 days. And now the general date of emergence is about the 23rd of January. So it's a record breaker. There aren't many plants that have advanced their flowering season by that much, but it's certainly a good, strong indication that you know, this species is really adapting its life cycle to be able to advance as soon as the season is there to progress. When we look at other species, this is the small tortoiseshell butterfly, sadly much rarer and scarcer now because of parasites and other problems than it used to be. I remember them being very common when I was a boy, and it's something that I always make a special note now to look at small tortoiseshell butterflies when I see them, because they have become much scarcer. But this is a species which overwinters as adults, and indeed they do come out of hibernation earlier, and indeed January is possible to see this species, and I've already got small tortoiseshell on my year list. We actually had one that emerged from hibernation in our house. So I don't know what happened to it, whether it will still survive. It was very, very early. But again, this is another species which is altering its life cycle. And it's okay if you get good weather to be able to emerge, and it may well be that it could survive. But of course, what these insects rely on is the availability of food plants. So plants like primrose, for example, very early flowering plant in our hedgerows and woodlands, an absolutely enormous nectar and pollen resource for insects coming out of hibernation. So these flowers are like beacons in hedgerows, advertising their wares to passing insects. Again, this was a photograph that I took today. So, you know, primroses are coming out in good number, and that's welcome for insects that are also emerging. And woodland plants in particular have a very tight window, because they have to time their flowering and their life cycle to miss the end of potentially hard weather and frosts. But they need to come out early enough to avoid the growth of the canopy in woodlands. So they have to time their cycle to miss the hardest of conditions, but also get in before the canopy closes over and they lose their struggle for light. For those of you that may be interested in taking the study of phenology further, I just want to talk for a moment about the Nature's Calendar scheme, which is run by the Woodland Trust, and is now the UK's main portal for providing information on a whole range of species, including seven-spot ladybird and a lot of other familiar species. So the survey encourages participants to record activity from a whole range of wildlife groups, flowers, trees, fungi, birds, of course, and insects. And respondents can actually record when they see the first flowering or the first arrival, the first emergence of insects, for example. So that provides a hugely important database, which then goes into online maps so that people can see in real time as the seasons change, where species are emerging, and see really the progress of spring across the UK. So I've given a fairly good indication of how our countryside and our natural environment is changing in response to our changing climate. What I'd like to do now is to really focus on some of the individual species that are where we're seeing changes in their population, or we're seeing changes in how they're responding to climate in a good or bad way. So this species is the little egret. I took this picture down in one of my favorite reserves on the estuary. And it's a species which has done really, really well in the UK. It's a bird that's perhaps more familiar to you if you've gone on Mediterranean holidays. You see it around wetlands in Mallorca and south of France, south of Spain. But about 25 years ago, there was a change, and little egrets started to become much more common in the UK. It's a smallish heron, and these herons were coming up from the continent, and then in '97 they started to breed around Poole Harbour, and that trend has continued with milder winters, with plenty of food available for these birds. They've done enormously well, and now it's possible to see them right up in Scotland and Ireland and everywhere where there's wetland or around the coast. It's possible to see little egrets. So whether this is a winner from climate change, it certainly has benefited. Climate change will have done it no harm in this country, at least. There's some suggestion that the population increase may have been a release from persecution pressure around the Mediterranean, and that, I'm sure, is certainly a factor. But it certainly is the case that this bird is doing particularly well, certainly here to stay, and I'm sure will continue to thrive and in time become one of our most familiar birds. And when I started bird watching in the 1970s, you just wouldn't see them. You know, they were very, very rare. Birders would chase all around the UK in order to see one. And now you can, we even had one at the Met Office last year. Which was quite something. I'm proud to say I recorded it as well. For winners, you have to look at losers as well. And what I want to talk about just briefly is some of the changes that we may expect to see from milder winters and how that may affect two of our most popular and engaging mammals. So if we look at the hibernation strategy of these two species, we've got Hazel Dormouse on the left and Hedgehog on the right. When winters were cold, these species used to be able to hibernate and generally go through winter without problem. But what we're finding is that hedgehogs frequently, and indeed Hazel Dormouse, will be roused from their slumber by warmer periods over winter. That encourages them to become more active, where they lose a lot of energy. And they need to find food quickly in order to build up their fat reserves. And that really, although you might think that a warmer winter would be an advantage to a small-bodied mammal, because obviously they lose a lot of heat, it does mean that they are facing an additional pressure. Now, I'm not going to say that climate change is the main problem for hedgehogs or Hazel Dormouse. Habitat loss and in the case of hedgehogs, collisions with vehicles are obviously a lot more important, but it is an additional pressure that these mammals have to face. And it's another case of where their ecology has been upset somewhat by the fact that our climate is changing. And obviously these species do need to adjust. Now, I was talking to a hedgehog expert last week, and he was telling me that in continental Europe, but particularly sort of in France and Spain, hedgehogs don't hibernate. They manage to go through without hibernation. But in the UK, our hedgehogs are used to hibernating. That's their strategy. With the longer breeding season, they're actually tending to have 2 litters instead of 1, which means that when we go into autumn and winter, there are a lot more young hedgehogs around which haven't got the target weight in order to go through into hibernation. And that is presenting quite a challenge for the species, and indeed for those kind-hearted souls that try and look after them. This next example that I've chosen is one that's very close to me. I've been birdwatching on estuaries since really the 1970s. And our estuaries in winter are hugely important for the arrival of birds coming in from all around the Arctic Circle and in Eastern Europe. So we get millions of birds, ducks, geese, swans, wading birds, as we've got here, curlew and redshank, all coming into this feeding frenzy around our estuaries. And these birds, when they're migrating from these colder breeding grounds, have to make a decision about their survival. If they're flying thousands of miles, they've got a certain energy budget that they're working to, and they have to trade that off against how cold it's going to be. So when you get these birds piling into UK estuaries, you get them right the way down into the southwest. This picture was taken on the X. But there are concerns that these birds are not necessarily traveling as far because conditions now are milder on the continent. And it could be that these birds don't actually migrate to the UK or as far across the UK as they used to. And that could present a challenge for these species, because although they might have ideal conditions in other parts of Europe where they don't need to escape the cold as far as they used to. Obviously, our estuaries are very rich and provide a huge food resource for them. And in other places, that food, I mean, if you look at Norway, for example, that's not particularly friendly to a wading bird that relies on huge tracts of soft mud and sand and mudflats in order to be able to find food. So that could potentially threaten some of these birds, and wading birds, particularly curlew, are among the most threatened birds in the UK, albeit for a variety of other reasons as well as climate change. But I think the theme that's coming out of this is that climate change is presenting a huge challenge to species, and an additional one to all the other factors that they're facing. It's not that these birds or wildlife can cope with climate change on its own. They're coping with a whole range of different changes, which is pushing birds like curlew to the wall, to be quite honest. It's one of the birds that I'm most fascinated by, and indeed most worried about as a many conservationists. It's not just bird populations where we're seeing changes. This grasshopper, long-winged conehead, back in the 80s was really found only along the south coast. But as conditions have improved and temperatures have warmed, we're actually seeing this species now right up into the Midlands. A very characteristic, quite large grasshopper, really unmistakable when you see it. But it's certainly one of those insects which is doing quite well from climate change in the UK, and indeed is spreading its range considerably. It's not just our terrestrial habitats that are seeing evidence of climate change. Our waters are too. I took this picture of a common dolphin off the west of Ireland, so not necessarily UK, but we do get the species all around the UK. And we're seeing them now much further north because of the rise in sea surface temperatures. Our coastal waters are increasing in temperature, and I've just put the graph there of the UK sea surface temperature. So you can see, again, a lot of variation in the temperature from year to year, but generally that trend line shows that temperatures are coming up, and indeed species, traditionally warm water species like common dolphin, are responding too, with them now being recorded widely in Scottish waters as well as the warmer waters off Western Ireland and Wales and the southwest of England. We're actually seeing new species coming into the UK. So this is a species called a median wasp, quite a large wasp. It was recorded first in the 1980s in Sussex as a new species, and now this is quite a widespread species. I photographed this one in Bedfordshire a few years ago, but it's a species now that is found right the way up into parts of Scotland, just beginning to colonise Scotland, and it is one of a number of species which will begin to increase their populations, and we're seeing already a number of different species potentially flirting with colonizing the UK from further south. And I'm going to conclude with, I'm going to go out on a limb now and say that I think this year the glossy ibis has its best chance of actually nesting in the UK. So this is a bird which traditionally was found in large tracts of wetland in southern Europe, so places like the Po Delta, the Danube Delta, the Cota Doñana in southern Spain, Camargue in France. These huge Mediterranean-style wetlands supported large numbers of glossy ibis. But what we're seeing now, this picture was taken by a colleague of mine a few weeks ago around the Exe estuary. We're seeing large numbers of these birds beginning to be around the UK over winter, multiple flocks of sort of 9 or 10 birds. And my former colleague at the RSPB has written a paper on the potential of glossy ibis to colonize Britain. And if we can get through the rest of winter without a really cold spell, and certainly the Met Office long-range forecast seems to indicate that may be the case. Obviously huge uncertainty, but there is potential for this bird if it can remain in good numbers around the UK, and we've got numbers of second year birds. They don't nest in their first year, but we've got numbers of more mature adults, and it is potentially possible that we could see perhaps a nesting attempt or two of this bird, which really would be the first in the UK. And it's possible that you know, going further out on that limb, that we could see this bird, you know, beginning to colonize the UK. I'm not going to suggest that it's going to mirror the little egret and colonize everywhere, but we've seen a number of birds from the Mediterranean region and further south in Europe, which are now thriving in the UK, thanks to our relatively warmer climate. But at the other end, sadly, we are seeing a number of species in northern Scotland and the Highlands of Scotland, which are really on the southern edge of their range, and any more warming will inevitably push them beyond the shores of the UK, more up into Iceland and Scandinavia. So I'm going to conclude my talk there. I'll just leave that slide up for a moment, just in case people want any further information on on climate change and the impact of British wildlife, or indeed want any more information about the climate. I'll plug the Met Office climate dashboard if anybody wants to have a look at some of the graphs that I produced in a bit more detail. Then there's a huge wealth of information available there. If people are interested in learning more about the Woodland Trust and Nature's Calendar, then there is a link to the Woodland Trust website. And I can't recommend this book highly enough. It was published in 2018 by British Wildlife Publishing, and it's a fantastic resource which really brings the climate change story in the UK and how it's affecting our wildlife up to date. So before I lose my voice, I'm going to pause there a moment and just say thank you very much for your time. There is a format for questions, so more than happy to take questions, but I will hand back to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Grahame, for a most interesting, thoroughly professional and beautifully illustrated talk. We really thoroughly enjoyed that, and all have learnt a great deal from you. And the illustrations are absolutely ravishing, and we've had comments on the chat room about that in particular. We've got quite a few questions and a certain number of comments that have come in about various different events in wildlife, in people's gardens and observations and so on. But just to get the ball rolling, we hear so much that's rather sad and dispiriting about climate change and habitat loss and so on. But are there any advantages for wildlife coming from the UK's changing climate?
Well, inevitably there will be some winners and losers. As I was saying towards the end of the talk, there are species which potentially could colonize the UK, but that does mean that inevitably what you gain, there will be species that are lost. So species like bee-eater, black-winged stilt, particularly Mediterranean type birds are flirting with the UK. They're not colonized yet, but we're getting nesting attempts every year or every other year. But inevitably there will be species that we'll lose. And I think the important thing to remember here is that climate change is never going to be a good thing, because it's happening so rapidly, much faster rate than really we've seen, certainly in the historical past. And we're asking wildlife to adapt to the climate that we're changing. It's not changing on its own, it's because we're changing it. And we're asking species to be able to do that at a time when they're struggling with so many other factors. So if you look at I'll pick an example of turtle dove, which in the UK is a summer migrant. Birds arrive in late spring and then try and find food available in the British countryside. They're a seed-eating bird primarily, almost exclusively. But this is a bird which is much more familiar around the Mediterranean. So it's one you should think, well, turtle doves at least will be secure, because the climate is in their favour. They favour a warmer climate than the UK. They've never really found much further north than sort of places like the Vale of York in the UK. But that's not the evidence, and the evidence from my former colleagues at RSPB is that we're probably going to lose that bird sometime this decade. May hang on in a few pockets, but it's not just climate change that these species have to contend with. They still face all the other factors. So that's I think the real challenge that we face here.
Thank you.
I hope that answers that question.
Yes, it does indeed, and very comprehensively. Thank you very much. We've got lots of comments. We've got from BZ. This is an extraordinarily professional, creative presentation. Thank you. That's from Caroline with big exclamation marks. And we have Liz Stevens, who said, I've got frogs mating in my pond today, but she doesn't actually say where she lives. But I was wondering if that's the kind of information that ought to be reported on one of these citizen science bases. And if so, which one would you recommend?
Well, I can't recommend Nature's Calendar highly enough. I don't use it. I really should. My life is a bit chaotic, so I don't always get the time to record these things. And I think it requires a certain degree of commitment to make the records meaningful. But if people have access to getting information about what's happening in their ponds on their walk to work, or things happening in their local neighborhood, then carrying on that tradition is hugely important, and recording frog spawn is one of the indicators that the Nature's Calendar is set up to record. So yes, please, people that are able to do it. And you don't have to be a great naturalist. That's the thing. The species are chosen to be familiar and readily identifiable. So, you don't have to be a professional naturalist to do it. So yes, please, the more information, the better. I think that getting that granularity of data is important for whatever science field you're in. But this is a particularly valuable one. So yes, please.
And we've got Caroline, who says, I have primroses which flower all year round in a damp, shady site, and I'm really glad to hear that I'm helping nature. Do you want to make any comment about that?
Well, I mean, it's good that these species are doing well. I mean, it's long been known, of course, that primrose is an early flowering. Obviously, the name Primrose, the first rose of spring, is a clue to how long that association of early flowering is. But it's a very important species, not just in its own right, but because it helps to sustain so many other species. How all these species fit together is hugely important. And providing any sort of habitat or shelter, whatever you can do in your garden or other space, is really important. So yeah, good to hear.
And we've got a question here that it said swarming seems to have started early as 1700s. So it seems to be part. I think maybe that should be written. The warming seems to have started as early.
Yes, sorry, the typo. It was a typo.
Not a problem. So it seems to be part of a natural cycle. Also, there may be cyclical cooling and warming, which we're only now recording, but it's been happening for a while. What is your take on that?
I think that it's, well, I mean, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have perhaps expressed it the most clearly. So in their latest AR6 report, which was published last year just ahead of the Glasgow Climate Conference, they're saying now that it's unequivocal that warming is because of us and that warming is happening. So I think people are quite right to challenge and to look at the longer term cycles of climate. And I'm sure there are things still to be discovered about the natural variability of our climate. But I think now when you look at the evidence that's growing so quickly, I was talking to, I mean, it's not a UK example, but I was talking to someone from an organisation that we work with in British Columbia about the heat wave in British Columbia last year. And, it almost got to 50 degrees in parts of British Columbia. I mean, it wasn't just, when you get records and temperature records, you expect them perhaps like a sporting record to be broken just marginally. But we're seeing, I think it was 4.5 or so degrees that the Canadian temperature record was broken by last year. So it's staggering the rate at which these records are being broken. And if I can just, provide further evidence from my colleagues that study this at the Met Office Hadley Centre. So there's a working assumption now that in the UK's weather record, that high temperature extremes outnumber cool temperature extremes by about 9 to 1. So that's giving a nod clearly to the fact that cold temperature extremes can still occur. And you've got examples like Beast from the East, where we saw the coldest spring day in the UK. But we're seeing, those days that we had at Cambridge, that record there that provided the hottest day on record in the UK. We've had the warmest winter day. And this is all within my time at the Met Office. So I've been with the Met Office 6 years, and I'm seeing national records go. So that's a very small window, isn't it, to see so many records go. I've also seen, I'm not taking responsibility for this, but I've seen, the 6 warmest global years on record in time that I've been doing climate at the Met Office. So, there is definite pattern for sure.
Thank you. We've got a question from Peter Sutton. One of my concerns is that it always seems to be the large birds that are said to be increasing. Does this suggest that many small birds are more specialized or at greater risk?
I think there's, I mean, if we look at some of the large-bodied birds that are around us, the ones that seem to do quite well, so jackdaw is doing pretty well, wood pigeon is doing very well, collared dove is doing well, but there are other large-bodied birds, grey partridge, for example, curlew, birds that are really not doing well at all, and black grouse, capercaillie. So there's a number of large-bodied birds which are not doing well. And I think it comes down generally to whether these species are specialist or generalist. So if you look at wood pigeon, which seem to be everywhere I go, they're a generalist feeder, well able to be very adaptable from feeding at bird tables to feeding in cereal crops. There's no problem with the conservation of species, but if you're a bit more specialist, like stone curlew, requiring specialist habitats and availability to certain features, then it seems that those are the ones perhaps that we're struggling more to hang on to in our countryside, because there isn't those that granularity of niches, if I can put it that way, that enables them to find space to survive. And those are the ones really that are struggling in particular.
Thank you. Peter Sutton has come back with, you talk about changes in spring, and you've made quite a lot of comment about that, but surely warmer Octobers and Novembers are also a factor. What is your take on that?
That's certainly the case. It's a plea actually from the Woodland Trust to get more information about what is happening to wildlife in autumn. So certainly perhaps there's more emphasis being put on spring. And I'm really glad for the question to be able to provide a little bit of explanation. So certainly, you know, there will be some benefits from perhaps warmer autumns for the individual. Perhaps more food, for example. You can think of examples like butterflies and dragonflies that are able to last longer into the autumn. We're seeing emperor dragonflies at the Met Office quite late into autumn. Common darters similarly quite late. So they're I think for the individual trying to survive and eke out their life a bit, there is an advantage in some of these things like warmer springs. Whether it's good for the species as a whole perhaps is a moot point.
Thank you. And Ekaterina Sklyar asks, do you have any data on how the snow cover influences the spring index?
No, I don't. I think that the spring index is really looking at things like the arrival of swallows as one of the key metrics for that index. So I'm not sure how snow cover would affect that. I mean, we don't really these days have much in the way of snow cover apart from northern hills and Scottish mountains. So I'm sorry, I can't really provide a comprehensive answer to that one. My suspicion is that, you know, any snow cover that remains is going to have gone largely before the evidence from the spring index begins to kick in.
Right. Now, another question from Peter Sutton is, do the early arriving swallows actually survive? Because he makes the observation that for turtle doves, finding seeds in May is an impossibility on a modern farm where all the grain stores are secured and seed growing is done much earlier, and seed sowing, I beg your pardon, is done much earlier. So do those early arriving swallows actually survive?
I have to wonder, and certainly in 2013, when we had that very, very cold spring, it was heartbreaking to see swallows and sand martins coming back, and there just was no flying insects for them whatsoever. So it would be interesting to know what their strategy is. But having flown all the way from South Africa, albeit in stages, they're obviously undertaking a huge journey, expending huge amounts of energy on that journey. So they really rely, a little bit like a motorway service station on a journey. You know, they're desperate to get here in order to find the food that they need, and to get here and effectively find the large bear, because there was no insects. And these species can only rely on flying insects. They can't switch to an alternative, can't feed at bird tables, for example. They have to rely on that. Whether some may have gone back to continental Europe and perhaps found conditions a bit warmer there. They'll play a numbers game, so the ones that arrive late may well be the ones to help keep the species going. But there certainly was a high mortality of some birds, particularly the ones that were monitored almost on an individual basis. Colleagues at RSPB were finding dead stone curlews in the fields that just couldn't sustain themselves with the lack of insects that were around during that very cold spring. But I think the point to remember here is that unless individual birds succumb to cold, they are longer lived. So if they have a bad year, even small-bodied birds will live 2 or 3 breeding seasons, but invertebrates have to manage every year in order to be able to survive to the next year, because they have annual life cycles. When you talk to entomologists, they get really concerned about that fact, because you know, those species, if they have a bad year, they have a really bad year, because they're literally putting all their eggs in one basket every year.
Very telling point there. Now we have Caroline making a comment and then asking, when I was studying conservation, I was shocked to be told that it was a choice of one species over another, because I'd always thought that it was about protecting all of nature and wildlife. And then later I realized that this was a very naive assumption. And it's interesting to see how the rewilding is bringing this discussion to the fore.
It's a very interesting question, and it's one that I don't feel necessarily qualified to answer, but I will give a little insight. I was fortunate last year that I had an opportunity to visit the Nettle estate in Sussex, where there is a very pioneering rewilding study that's going on. And if anybody wants to read Isabella Tree's wilding book, I thoroughly recommend it. Basically, what they've done is they've taken, gone out of dairy production and turned the land completely over to conservation, and just seeing what happens, right? They're not necessarily, there's no formal plan as such, other than just withdrawing agricultural input. But they're seeing amazing opportunities with nightingales and turtle doves coming back to that part of Sussex. And they're certainly working with other landowners to try and encourage that same mindset about what is possible. So there are these beacons where really visionary conservation efforts are being put in place. And I think it's going to be a mix. You know, in order to give the species the best chance of survival, you probably need some of those big projects. You need conservation management, but also you need everybody doing their bit. You know, some of these species rely more than just on one landowner. They rely on lots and lots of individuals and everybody doing their bit. So I think that's going to be the way that some of our species survive. So rewilding is great for turtle doves and nightingales, but for a bird like skylark, you're going to need, where it occurs everywhere in the UK, it's one of our most widespread birds, you're actually going to need landowners across the UK to do a little bit for that bird in order to help keep the population up. You can't just have it in discrete sites.
And I have a question that I would like to pose, which follows on from what we've just been talking about, habitat and climate. Which is the greatest threat to wildlife? Is it habitat loss or is it climate change?
That's a very good question. I think that for some species, habitat loss is a particular threat. But then twisting the answer slightly, you've got habitats that are going to change because of climate change. So we know that some habitats are going to need to move in order to take opportunities of the new climate. There's going to be a general drift northwards. So I think the species perhaps that will be most in trouble are those that can't move. So some plants, some invertebrates, particularly reptiles and amphibians that aren't necessarily that mobile. Birds generally can be pretty mobile. Even the more sedentary ones will generally be able to colonize new areas relatively quickly and easily. My worry would be about those species like frogs and lizards and snakes and some of the other species that are not terribly mobile. They can't necessarily disperse a long way. So how will they cope with climate change and habitat loss, living in little discrete pockets? What's going to happen to them? So I think when you look at it, both threats are coming together for some of those species in particularly troubling ways.
Now, we've got a question from Paula Tiller, and she says, is it known whether fruit eaters are doing better than the insect-eating birds?
That's a very good question. It depends, I think. So certainly some insectivorous birds are not doing well, but it tends to be the ones which I've said earlier are the long-distance migrants, the ones that are really in trouble. Frugivorous birds, particularly, I mean, moving it slightly, seed eaters are struggling in farmland, as was mentioned earlier with the case of turtle dove. So I think it depends on, it's hard to make a generalization. It sometimes is dependent on what habitats these birds rely on. So a good example here would be a bird like redback shrike, which is a bird about the size of a starling. It's a songbird, but it's predatory, and it preys on large insects and small mammals, lizards, that sort of thing. That bird should benefit from climate change. It should be one that we're seeing more regularly. If you go to southern Spain and places, you see shrikes more frequently than certainly you would in the UK. But reading accounts of how these birds historically were, you know, birds of Devon suggests that you could take a car journey and see redback shrike sitting on telephone wires in parts of North Devon. You don't do that now. They've gone completely. Wryneck, similarly, a small woodpecker that used to occur widely across the UK. I remember reading when I was at the RSPB, we had the archive of the Society magazine. And I remember in one edition that I was going through from 1908, there were adverts for wryneck nest boxes in the RSPB magazine. This is a bird that's officially extinct in the UK now, apart from ones that we get on migration. feeds on ants, should be a species that does well with climate change. So I think it depends to a large extent on how specialist you are and whether you're having other challenges as a species. But certainly you can pick winners and losers from most species groups.
We've got a question from Dipali Gaskell, who asks about cyclical patterns in the climate, and were there any reliable earlier than 18th century records kept?
There is a lot of records, particularly from ship's logs and from weather stations and observers, and there is a huge project which I know Royal Meteorological Society, Reading University and Met Office have been involved with to try and encourage the digitisation of those records so that we can get an even better understanding of past climates. So that is a hugely important area for understanding more about what happened with weather events and climate in the past. We have good records, but as you go further back, the records become more scant. But that in part is because you've got records in paper form that can't yet form part of a digitised archive. And that is a huge project for Met Office to understand more about past climates, because one of the things that we want to try and find is whether there are extreme events in the past which haven't been properly catalogued and fitted into the climate record. So anyone who has the potential to help digitize some of these records will be doing a great service, because it will help us. If we can understand more about the past, we can put the modern climate more in a context.
Right. Well, that takes me very nicely on to the next question. Well, it was more an observation or a comment from Paula Tiller. What about ice cores? Ice cores are being obviously drilled out and analysed now, but how does the sort of the long-term generalised record that is entrapped within an ice core relate to these specific climate changes here in Britain?
Well, it helps us to. It's a hugely important series of records, because it helps us to understand more about past climates beyond the instrumental age. So in order to understand more about climates before even prehistory, you have to look for proxies for the instrumental record. And things like measurements of ice cores, for example, and tree rings is another good example, where you've got this non-instrumental evidence where the footprint of climate is still visible in the Earth system, as long as you can read it. Are hugely important and gives us confidence as to how much our climate is changing now. When you look at ice cores and don't see that much variation for 800,000 years, and then see all of a sudden a shift in the climate, you know that there are huge changes happening now because of CO2 levels, for example, in the atmosphere, highest for 800,000 years.
Right.
And we'd only have that evidence from things like ice cores.
Right. Thank you on that. Now, you have touched on and commented on how nature is trying to adjust to changing cycles, but isn't that, and certainly in the short term, there are going to be some winners and some losers, but in the longer term, isn't that just the point of evolution after all?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, I'm not getting teary-eyed necessarily about extinction. It's a natural part of evolutionary process. Um, so, but when you look at the rate of extinction now compared with the background rate, we are fast approaching an extinction event. Species have always gone extinct. So, you know, that is a factor, but it's just that we're pushing the rate of extinction possibly to a point that may be beyond sustainability. So I liken it to, you know, looking at a threadbare carpet. You can still see the pattern, but it's wearing awfully thin and becoming quite threadbare in places. And how long before that carpet becomes unsustainable and starts to fragment and break up. You know, parts of Northwest Europe, you are beginning to see that happening with species. I mean, people say about, you know, the loss of insects is possibly one of the greatest challenges that we face, because they're our pollinators, they're a food source for the species that we love. And I mean, people love insects in their own right. I'm not saying shouldn't love insects for themselves, but you know, they're such an important cornerstone of our countryside that we lose them at our peril, and particularly with pollinators like hoverflies and bees and others. You know, we can't easily or at all replicate the ecosystem services that they provide for us with our food and the flowers and everything that we enjoy.
Paula Tiller has come back and she says, thank you for your answers so far. It's been absolutely fascinating, but I feel very teary-eyed when we have the capacity to do things so differently from the way we are currently doing them.
This is very much a personal view, but I tend to think that the crises that we face, humanity, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, to an extent, the development and sustainability crisis, these are all such big topics that if you tried to tackle all of them but do them individually, it feels like you wouldn't possibly do them because they're all so big. But it feels like there's a chance, if you can put them together, that you can do things. So with things like rewilding, for example, you know, you can solve more than one by planting trees, as long as you've got the right trees in the right place. You've got an opportunity to draw down carbon from the atmosphere, but you've also got an opportunity to help arrest part of the biodiversity crisis. So there are things that can be done. There's lots of optimistic talk about things like blue carbon, where if you've got rewilding projects at sea, seagrass, for example, draws down mangroves, draw down huge amounts of carbon, but provide nurseries for fish and habitats. So if you try and do these things individually, I don't think you do them. But if you look at them as a whole, well, we've got all these problems to deal with. How can we deal with them in ways which help to provide solutions to more than one problem? Then, you know, I'm an optimist. We're going to get through this.
Following on from what you've been commenting on, Grahame, is I would like to hear your comments on the importance of citizen science bases more generally, and how that has evolved over the centuries here in the United Kingdom, and their uses and abuses.
I think with citizen science that we've got a legacy in this country of producing some of the finest naturalists, dare I say it. We've got a legacy of producing some of the finest meteorologists, and that comes because of our passion, I think, for those two subjects. And as a nation, I think we have a fondness for science that enables us to gather huge amount of data. And citizen science, I've been involved in one way or another with citizen science for a long time. And there are things that our scientists rely on that without the help from the army of citizen scientists, we wouldn't be able to achieve. So it's hugely important and growing in importance, because it allows, if you've got an army of volunteers doing things on a very granular basis across the UK, for example, whether that's monitoring weather records or climate records or wildlife or even the stars, the heavens, it means that professional scientists can interrogate data that's coming back. And it also means that they can, the professionals can devote themselves to perhaps the science that's not so popular or easier to undertake, might require more specialist skills, and that means that they be then freed up to do work that you couldn't invoke citizen scientists to do. But it's important and good for the soul. I mean, it's great to be able to put something back and learn about something and you know, think of the value that you've contributed. It's wonderful. More, please.
We have a question from Dipali Gaskell. Is there more reason for optimism than for pessimism on the whole, on balance?
I think we have to be optimists, don't we? I had the good fortune to be at the climate conference in Glasgow, and the scale of the problem is enormous, as the ever mounting body of science is proving. But you know, we have to face these challenges with a degree of optimism that they're still possible. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about the chances of staying around 1.5 degree rise in temperature above pre-industrial levels. It's getting harder. The more carbon we put into the atmosphere, the harder that will be to be able to stay at that threshold or even ideally below. But it's still there. It's still mathematically possible. And you know, if we don't, then the challenges that we face will be even more enormous. So yeah, I'm an optimist. I think it is possible, but it requires an increasing application of effort if we are going to do it. But I think, you know, I think that one of the interesting things is that we're seeing industry and different sectors coming forward. Obviously, we're seeing huge support from the public, but you're seeing financial institutions and others looking at climate because, you know, there's risks involved. They need to protect their assets and look for opportunities and things. So I think it's beginning to turn a corner where we've, you know, got industry and financial institutions that are actually looking at the challenges around climate change, and they're helping to drive, in a lot of cases, to drive this forward. So yeah, I think momentum is growing. So let's be optimistic and hope that, you know, we can resolve this. Well,
Grahame, we've come to pretty much the end of the questions and the end of your talk. You've given us a wonderfully interesting talk, beautifully illustrated, lots of really sound science in there, some great graphs that show us beyond any shadow of a doubt what's happening to the global, the local, the British, the UK weather cycles. And I think that our audience have been absolutely riveted and educated and entertained tonight. And I really would like to say thank you very much indeed. And I'm getting all sorts of flashing screen messages coming up saying thank you. It was wonderful. We thoroughly enjoyed it. It was an excellent.
Good, thank you.
So,
well, thank you for the opportunity. So it was nice to meet the group and the people who found the time to engage. So thanks to everybody. It's been very enjoyable.